Usually, economic diagnostics are presented to you like an X-ray.
Right, very clinical.
Exactly. You break your arm, the X-ray shows this jagged white line on a black background, and the doctor just points and says, there it is. There is the fracture.
It's binary. It's clean.
Yeah, and honestly, it's comforting. We like our problems to be, highly visible and easily categorized. But what happens when a country does exactly what economists say, guarantees explosive wealth?
Hitting the ultimate demographic jackpot, basically.
Right, but then the economic engine just completely stalls out. So today, we are taking you on a deep dive into some fascinating data from El Salvador. Data that proves this jackpot can actually become a massive, incredibly complex trap.
It really is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters.
We're exploring the anatomy of a missed demographic dividend. Okay, let's unpack this, because the 15-part presentation we have in front of us is just packed with data.
And it's a lot to process. We are looking at an economy that, strictly on paper, should be experiencing a massive, unstoppable boom.
The ingredients are all there.
They are. The fundamental ingredients for explosive prosperity are sitting right there. But in reality, the system is barely keeping its head above water.
Which is insane to think about.
It is, and I can promise you, by the end of this deep dive, you are going to understand the invisible gears that drive, or in this specific case, completely halt a nation's prosperity.
Because this data challenges, some of our most deeply held assumptions about population growth and wealth generation, right?
Absolutely. It turns the conventional models completely upside down.
So let's establish the core paradox you're going to see in this data. There is a stark, minimalist visual in the very first section of this analysis.
Page 1, right?
Yeah, page 1. It's just this white background with bold, dark gray text. And right in the middle is this highly contrasting dual-line trend chart.
It's a very striking visual.
One line represents the youth dependency ratio, and it is plunging downward at this dramatic angle.
A total free fall.
Right. And the other line represents per capita national net income growth. Now, instead of rocketing up to match that plunging dependency, it is essentially flatlining.
Well, not just flatlining, it's vibrating with these violent, jagged fluctuations.
Exactly. And right where these two lines aggressively diverge, the analyst drew this huge red dashed circle.
That circle is everything.
The annotation basically says abundant labor force, but the economic engine has stalled.
That red dashed circle is where traditional macroeconomic theory goes to die, honestly.
Wow, strong words.
I mean it.
Yeah.
The golden rule of population economics, the one taught in literally every introductory development course, is that when a country's youth dependency ratio drops and its working age population hits its absolute peak, the economy takes off.
The famous demographic dividend.
Exactly. The logic is incredibly straightforward. You have fewer young children to feed, clothe, and educate per adult.
So your expenses drop.
Right. And simultaneously, you have this massive tidal wave of young, energetic people entering the workforce.
Like we saw in South Korea or Japan or China.
Yes, all the classic examples. The surplus capital that used to go to pediatric care and basic schooling is suddenly freed up. It goes into industrial investment. But here, looking at this chart, the working age population is at a record high, while per capita, national income growth is totally stagnant.
And occasionally plunges into the negative, which is wild. It's basically a massive state-of-the-art car engine that's completely disconnected from the transmission.
That is a phenomenal analogy.
You have this perfectly fueled, roaring engine, which is the labor force, right? And you can press the gas pedal all you want.
Just revving it constantly.
Yeah, you can rev that massive labor force to the red line all day long. But because the transmission is missing, the wheels of the actual economy aren't turning.
Revving the engine isn't moving the car forward.
It's just generating an immense amount of heat and friction. So why does this break those conventional models?
Well, we have to look at the assumptions baked into those mid-20th century models. They often operated on a rather mechanistic assumption that labor volume automatically translates into economic value.
Like treating people like coal or steel.
Exactly. Just raw inputs. Put more coal in the furnace, get more heat. But human beings are not just raw inputs.
Right.
If the surrounding economic ecosystem, so the industries, the infrastructure, the financial markets, the legal frameworks, if that ecosystem cannot absorb that labor and put it to highly productive use, that potential energy just dissipates.
You get the heat, but no forward motion. But I struggle to reconcile this when looking at the actual numbers.
How so?
You're saying a massive working age population is theoretically an advantage, but looking at the plunging GDP growth rates over time on this chart, it seems like having a massive idle youth population isn't a dividend at all.
It can be incredibly destabilizing.
It feels like a powder keg, right? Isn't this demographic window actually a massive liability if the institutions aren't ready to absorb the workers?
You are hitting on the exact terror that keeps development economists awake at night. A demographic dividend is never a guarantee.
It's just a chance.
Exactly. It is merely a window of opportunity. It is a time-limited offer. If you don't build the transmission while the engine is revving, that engine eventually burns out.
So to understand the scale of what is being squandered here, we really need to look at the pure demographic mathematics mapped out on page 2.
The golden window.
Right. The data tracking the population structure here shows a stacked area chart with these smooth, sweeping curves. And you see the youth dependency ratio, that's the 0 to 14 age group, falling off an absolute cliff.
The drop is staggering.
Historically, it was up near 90% now. It's dropped down to roughly 52%.
And look at the middle band.
Yeah, there is a deep blue upward arrow highlighting the 15 to 64 age bracket. That prime working age group has expanded to take up over 67% of the entire population.
We really need to break down the reality of a 90% dependency ratio for a second so you, the listener, can grasp the shift here.
Because that number is hard to even picture.
If you are living in an economy with a 90% dependency ratio, it means almost every single working adult is financially carrying a non-working child or an elderly person on their back.
A 1-to-1 ratio of earner to dependent?
Basically, yes. If you are a young couple in that environment, every single cent you earn goes toward basic caloric survival, primary schooling, and keeping a roof over your heads.
There is zero surplus.
None. You aren't investing in the stock market, you aren't starting a high-risk tech company, and you certainly aren't saving for massive capital expansion.
The entire nation is effectively living paycheck to paycheck, focused entirely on just raising the next generation.
Precisely. But when that dependency drops to 52%, a massive structural release of capital should occur.
Because suddenly the household budget has breathing room.
Yes, and the national budget has breathing room. The state doesn't need to build 100 new elementary schools every single year.
They can take that money and build deep water ports or fiber optic networks.
Or advanced research universities. This is the golden window. You literally have a supermajority of your country in their 20s, 30s, and 40s.
Okay, so if you have a supermajority of the population in their prime physical and mental working years, how do you mess up a sure thing?
That's the tragic part of this data.
I mean, if 67% of the people are capable of working 8 to 10 hours a day, generating output, isn't it mathematically impossible to remain stagnant?
It is not impossible,
Yeah.
and the data on page 3 shows how they are messing it up through extreme structural fragility.
The stumbling growth section.
Right. We are looking at a combination bar and trend line chart here. It tracks GDP per capita at constant 2015 prices.
And the trend line is just agonizingly slow.
It's painfully inching along in the $2,300 to $500 range over the course of decades.
But what is truly alarming is the bar chart below it, representing the annual growth rate.
Those red arrows are hard to miss.
There are these terrifying red downward arrows marking years where growth didn't just stall, it violently contracted. We're looking at plunges of minus 4.2%.
And in some key historical moments, a staggering minus 10.11%.
That looks less like an economic growth chart and more like an erratic heart monitor.
It exposes the profound vulnerability of this growth. It completely lacks sustained momentum.
Which you need to actually build wealth.
Exactly. Compounding interest, compounding national wealth. These things require predictable, boring, upward stability.
If your economy is running on a treadmill, but occasionally someone unplugs the treadmill,
You trip, you fall backward.
and you have to spend the next 5 years just recovering the ground you lost.
When you have growth that fragile, you cannot compound national wealth. And without that, your 67% working age population is just trapped in a cycle of recovery rather than advancement.
So if they aren't advancing, what are they actually doing? I mean, what are these millions of prime age workers doing from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. every day?
To answer that, we have to look at the structural transformation of the industries on page 4.
And the data here is a massive red flag. There is a horizontal percentage stacked bar chart comparing historical and current value added to the GDP by different sectors.
The visual is incredibly striking.
Yeah, there is a clear call-out line pointing to the agriculture sector. Its share of GDP plummeted from an impressive 41% down to a mere 5.6%.
That is the complete and total collapse of an entire way of life. It's the end of a rural economic ecosystem.
Now, in a perfectly functioning development model, the decline of agriculture is natural, right?
Yes, it usually means tractors and modern farming techniques have made agriculture so efficient that you don't need 40% of your population working the fields.
Those workers then move to the cities, enter light manufacturing, and eventually transition into the high-value service sector.
That's the textbook progression.
Right, because when I hear service economy, my mind instantly goes to a highly developed nation. I think of Silicon Valley software engineering, high-end corporate finance, biotech.
Advanced logistics, sure, those are high-value, high-productivity services. But we have to make a critical distinction here.
Because that is not what the data is showing us in El Salvador.
Not at all. The annotation on the chart specifically warns that while the service sector ballooned to take over the vast majority of the economy, productivity hit a hard bottleneck.
They call it hollow service sector growth.
Exactly. We were talking about low-wage retail, informal street vending, basic domestic work, and micro-commerce.
It's a massive ecosystem of people buying and selling imported goods to one another in the informal, unregulated market.
It's essentially a farmer selling their heavy-duty tractor to buy a hot dog stand.
Oh, that's a perfect analogy. Technically, according to the macroeconomic categorization, they have successfully transitioned from the agriculture sector to the service industry.
But they aren't generating more wealth.
In fact, they have lost their primary capital asset, the tractor, and are now locked into a highly vulnerable, low-margin daily grind.
Where their economic output is capped by how many hot dogs they can physically hand out in a day.
The structural transformation occurred on paper, but the productivity transformation did not.
You have a service economy without the underlying wealth generation that usually funds a service economy.
And when your domestic industry cannot generate wealth on its own, the economy has to survive somehow, right? It has to find an external life support system.
Which brings us to page 5, and one of the most eye-opening visualizations in this entire deep dive.
The IV drip of external funding. It's a dual-axis chart. On the left axis, we see billions of dollars in personal cross-border remittances money sent home from citizens working abroad flowing into the country.
A massive river of cash.
And on the right axis, we see official development assistance, essentially foreign aid, which at one point spiked to over $112 per capita.
Because domestic industry is fundamentally hollowed out, the country is surviving on outside money.
We are looking at a classic, albeit slightly modified, case of the economic phenomenon known as Dutch disease.
For context, Dutch disease usually refers to a country discovering a massive natural resource, like oil or natural gas.
Right, and the sudden influx of foreign cash from selling that oil drives up the value of the local currency.
Which makes the country's domestic manufacturing exports incredibly expensive for the rest of the world to buy, effectively killing local industry.
But in this case, the oil isn't crude bubbling up from under the ground.
No, it's billions of dollars in remittances from citizens working in the United States or elsewhere.
We're seeing a classic reservation wage issue here. But it's fascinating because usually we see that concept applied to wealthy welfare states in Western Europe, not developing nations.
Very unique distortion.
The text box hovering over that massive spike in remittances points out that this giant influx of foreign cash props up consumption, which is great for immediate survival, but it pushes up the reservation wage.
And that's where the trap springs.
How exactly is this remittance influx warping the baseline standard of living in a developing market?
It is a brilliant and tragic distortion of the labor market. The reservation wage is basically the lowest possible wage at which a worker is willing to accept a particular type of job.
Okay, let's build a very granular hypothetical for the listener.
Let's do it. Imagine a multinational garment company wants to open a factory in San Salvador.
Okay.
They run their global numbers, and they determine they can offer $300 a month for entry-level, formal assembly line work.
In many developing nations without massive remittances, workers would flock to that job because $300 a month is significantly better than zero.
Exactly. It provides a foothold into formal employment.
Right. They get a contract, maybe some basic benefits, and they start building a resume.
But now, inject the remittances into the equation.
Right.
If a local 22-year-old is living in a household that routinely receives $400 or $500 a month from an uncle working construction in Los Angeles, that household has a guaranteed safety net.
The baseline standard of living has been artificially inflated by foreign money.
Yes. So when that 22-year-old looks at the factory offering $300 a month for grueling, highly structured 8-hour shifts under a manager, they do the rational economic math.
They say, no, thank you.
Exactly. They say, I can survive on my family's remittance, and maybe I'll make a little extra cash selling phone cases informally on the street a few hours a day.
I'm not going to sweat in a factory for less than my uncle sends home.
Exactly.
Wow. So it's essentially like getting a very generous weekly allowance from a wealthy relative.
That's a great way to think about it.
It's just enough money to make you turn down a grueling entry-level job, but it is definitely not enough money to make you rich.
No, you can't build long-term generational wealth on it.
Or fund your own retirement. You are trapped in this comfortable, low-growth stasis.
And zoom out to the perspective of the factory owner. They cannot find cheap labor because the remittances have artificially inflated the wage floor.
But the country isn't actually productive enough in terms of infrastructure or education to justify paying higher wages.
So the factory owner simply packs up and builds their facility in Vietnam or Bangladesh instead.
It is a massive, suffocating economic paradox. The exact same money that is keeping the country's citizens fed and clothed is the exact same money preventing the country from industrializing.
It's a trap made of cash.
That is an incredibly insidious trap. You are being comfortably starved of your own industrial potential.
But if we are going to talk about the labor force turning down jobs, we also have to look at whether they are actually qualified for the high-value jobs that might pay above that reservation wage.
Right, which takes us to page 6. The first massive human capital bottleneck, learning poverty.
The visual representation here is genuinely unsettling.
It really is. It's an isotype chart, a pictogram. You have 10 little human icons representing primary school-aged boys.
And nearly 7 out of those 10 icons are shaded in a dark, heavy gray.
Yeah, and the bold text below it hits like a ton of bricks. 65.9% of primary school-aged boys fail to meet the absolute minimum reading standard.
You have to deeply contrast that terrifying 65.9% failure rate with the macro statistics that are often touted by governments on the global stage.
Because the official data often claims that youth literacy is over 90%.
But we have to define our terms here. Literacy, in a purely bureaucratic sense, simply means a citizen can sign their own name, sound out the letters on a street sign, and perhaps read a basic grocery list.
It is mechanical decoding.
Yes. Learning poverty, which is what that dark gray shading represents, is a completely different beast.
How so?
It means a child has sat in the classroom for years, but they fundamentally fail to comprehend a basic text. They cannot read a paragraph of instructions, synthesize the information, and explain what it means.
Let's apply that directly to the labor market. You cannot run a modern, high-value service economy with those numbers.
It's impossible.
You cannot build a workforce of software developers, complex logistics managers, or advanced manufacturing technicians if 2/3 of your male workforce cannot comprehend a basic instructional manual.
Right. If I put a young worker who suffers from learning poverty in front of a modern CNC machine or ask them to manage inventory software, they are going to fail.
Not because they aren't smart, but because the foundational human software was never installed.
Precisely. There is an enormous critical difference between physical presence in a classroom and the actual cognitive acquisition of human capital.
When we talk about the demographic dividend, we broadly assume those millions of young people possess the skills to compete in a hyper-competitive global economy.
We assume they can transition from the secondary sector to the tertiary knowledge-based sector.
But this data shows that a terrifying percentage of them are entering the global workforce intellectually unarmed.
The cognitive load required for modern supply chain jobs simply exceeds the basic literacy they were provided.
Unarmed for the global economy, that's a brutal reality. But it's not just the mind that's under attack during this demographic window, right?
No, it's the physical body and the societal structure as a whole.
The data on page 7 shifts our focus to the second human capital bottleneck, violence and health.
And looking at this time series step chart, the historical context is incredibly grim.
It tracks the intentional homicide rate over time, and there is a stark red circle highlighting the historical peaks up to 13 per 100,000 people.
Alongside that, there's a note regarding a stubbornly high mortality rate from non-communicable diseases, things like cardiovascular issues.
We have to view this through a strictly economic lens, stripping away the social tragedy for a moment to understand the financial mechanics.
Rampant violence and extortion act as a massive, hidden, and highly regressive tax on businesses.
Right, because when intentional homicide and extortion rates reach those historical peaks, you experience immediate, violent capital flight.
No rational foreign corporation will build a regional headquarters or even a local distribution center in a zone where their employees are at daily physical risk and their supply trucks are routinely hijacked.
Right, and the damage isn't just the foreign capital leaving, it's the domestic human capital fleeing as well.
It's the ultimate brain drain.
If you are a highly skilled civil engineer, a brilliant cardiovascular surgeon, or a tech entrepreneur in El Salvador, and you feel fundamentally unsafe, you take your talents, your tax dollars, and your innovation to a different country.
The best, most mobile workers leave first.
And the businesses that do decide to stay, they aren't spending their surplus profits on research and development, upgrading their software, or giving their employees raises.
They are forced to spend that capital on barbed wire, armored transport vehicles, and heavily armed private security guards.
Which is entirely deadweight loss from an economic productivity standpoint.
Completely. A security guard, while absolutely necessary in that environment, does not produce a new good or service that can be exported. They simply prevent loss.
Now, looking closely at the chart, you will notice a prominent green downward arrow indicating a recent sharp and significant improvement in the security situation.
The violence metrics have plummeted.
Which is obviously fantastic news for the daily lives, the mental health, and the physical safety of the citizens. But from a macroeconomic perspective, I have to ask, how long does the hangover of high security costs last in the minds of international investors?
That is the million-dollar question for the entire region. Institutional memory in global finance is incredibly long.
And capital is inherently, fundamentally risk-averse.
Exactly. It takes years, sometimes decades, of sustained, boring, predictable stability to completely erase the risk premium that investors attach to a historically volatile market.
They need to see that the peace is institutionalized, not just a temporary truce.
Peace is the absolute prerequisite for economic growth, but peace alone does not guarantee immediate growth. It merely stops the bleeding.
Which perfectly sets up the data on page 8 detailing the harsh labor reality.
So let's synthesize what we know so far.
Right, we have this massive youth population. They are severely underskilled due to systemic learning poverty. Their wage expectations are warped by remittances.
And they are navigating an economy that is just starting to physically recover from decades of historical violence.
So what does their daily economic grind actually look like? There's a donut chart here breaking down the labor structure.
And the highlighted slice of that donut is massive.
Between 37 and 39% of the total workforce is trapped in what the analysts classify as vulnerable employment.
This forces us to redefine what the word employed actually means.
Because in a highly developed nation, employed usually means a W-2 form, a legally binding contract, health benefits, paid time off,
and a retirement contribution. But in this context, vulnerable employment means self-employed street vendors, day laborers on construction sites, or unpaid family helpers in micro businesses.
It means you work 12 physically exhausting hours a day, but if you get the flu on Tuesday, you don't earn enough to eat on Wednesday.
There is zero safety net. There is no unemployment insurance.
And the data specifically calls out a massive chunk of NEET youth, not in education, employment, or training.
If nearly 40% of your workforce is vulnerable and completely uncontracted, and a huge portion of your youth is just sitting idle,
your demographic dividend is effectively evaporating into thin air. You are burning daylight on that golden window.
Every day that passes is a day of lost compounding potential. Evaporating is the exact right word.
Because human capital, unlike a physical resource like gold or silver, actively degrades if it isn't used.
A 22-year-old who spends 5 years sitting idle or selling sliced fruit at a busy intersection doesn't just lose 5 years of minimum wage income.
They lose the compounding skill development, the on-the-job training, and the professional networking that would have made them a high-value, high-earning worker at age 30.
The long-term scarring on their lifetime earnings potential is profound.
And if you look closely at the data on page 9 to see who is suffering the most in this fragile labor market, you uncover another massive structural flaw.
The marginalized female labor force.
There is an entire section dedicated exclusively to this. The visual they chose here is a dumbbell plot.
If you haven't seen one, imagine 2 distinct dots connected by a horizontal line used to cleanly show the gap or disparity between 2 data points.
And the gap shown here is an absolute chasm. There is a massive 20% gap between genders regarding vulnerable employment.
Over 50% of working women are trapped in vulnerable employment, compared to only about 30% of men.
The notes also explicitly mention the tragic presence of female child labor in agriculture.
When we talk about harvesting a demographic dividend, the fundamental, unavoidable math requires that the entire working-age population is activated and highly productive.
You cannot achieve escape velocity as an economy if half of your population is systemically marginalized, undereducated, or legally unprotected.
It's just not mathematically possible.
Imagine trying to win an Olympic relay race, but right before the starting gun fires, you intentionally tie one of your runner's shoelaces together.
Great visual. You can't reap a demographic dividend if half your workforce is economically sidelined, dramatically underpaid, or pushed entirely into the informal, vulnerable sector.
It's mathematically impossible to reach peak national GDP if 50% of your engines are turned off.
Exactly. The productive potential of female labor in this economy is entirely untapped.
Bringing women into formal, legally protected, high-productivity roles is perhaps the single largest, most immediate lever the country could pull to instantly increase household incomes.
And drive GDP growth. But to do that, you need businesses willing and able to offer those formal jobs.
Which requires massive amounts of capital.
Which brings us to the root cause of this entire economic paradox on page 10.
Yes, the institutional resistance. This is where we look at the systemic, underlying, deeply rooted roadblocks to formal job creation.
And before we dive into this specific data, I want to make it incredibly clear that our goal here is absolute, strict political neutrality.
Right. We are not analyzing politicians or parties. We are just looking at the cold, hard, objective data provided in this deck.
And the data here is visualized on a radar chart, sometimes called a spider chart, mapping out institutional percentiles.
The metrics for control of corruption and regulatory quality are stubbornly stuck in the low 32 to 40 range.
The analysts have shaded this entire low-scoring area with a pale red background, explicitly labeling it a severe institutional deficit.
Analyzing this purely objectively, strictly from the perspective of a global capital allocator sitting in a boardroom in New York, London, or Tokyo.
Capital is fundamentally cowardly. I use that word very intentionally.
Cowardly, right. Capital does not want a grand adventure. It wants boring predictability.
It absolutely requires the rule of law. If a multinational corporation is deciding where to build a $200 million advanced manufacturing plant, they run extensive mathematical risk models.
If a country's regulatory quality is ranked in the 30th percentile globally, it means the rules of the game, the tax codes, the labor laws, the export tariffs, might change overnight without warning.
And if control of corruption is low, it means the daily operational costs are completely unpredictable and legally perilous.
So the large-scale, formal job creators, the massive multinational companies that offer multi-year contracts, comprehensive health insurance, maternity leave, and advanced training programs, they look at that pale red zone on the radar chart.
And they simply invest their millions in a different developing country where the institutional percentiles are safely in the 70s or 80s.
They bypass the risk entirely.
Precisely. They owe a fiduciary duty to their shareholders to maximize returns and minimize risk.
And the direct, undeniable result of that institutional deficit is capital starvation, which is vividly illustrated on page 11.
The frozen business environment.
Let's look at this bar chart. There is a baseline drawn horizontally across it, representing a healthy, growing, emerging market.
For a developing country to truly modernize, build infrastructure, and create a robust middle class, macroeconomists generally like to see foreign direct investment, or FDI, at a minimum of around 3% of GDP.
That means foreign money is constantly, reliably flowing in to build factories, data centers, and logistics hubs.
But the bars representing this economy's FDI are routinely below 1%.
And there are even downward red arrows showing years where it plunges into negative territory.
Negative FDI.
That literally means more capital is fleeing the country than entering it.
It is the ultimate leading indicator of economic stagnation. If you think back to our causal chain, poor, unpredictable institutions lead to high perceived risk.
High perceived risk leads directly to low or negative FDI.
And low FDI leads directly to the hollow service economy and the 40% vulnerable employment rate we discussed earlier.
Without foreign capital injecting new life, new technology, and new management practices into the economy, the system slowly cannibalizes itself.
I mean, put yourself in the shoes of a hypothetical investor.
Okay, imagine opening a mid-sized factory. You have to buy land, import heavy machinery, navigate customs, and hire hundreds of workers.
If the regulations change constantly, if you have to navigate a labyrinth of opaque permits, and if you have to spend 10% of your gross revenue on private security just to protect your supply chain.
Why wouldn't you just build that factory elsewhere? The friction is too high.
which is exactly what happens. The money flows to Southeast Asia or Eastern Europe or to other more stable parts of Latin America,
And without that foreign capital creating a robust tax base, the local government has to take on the massive burden of trying to stimulate the economy itself.
often stretching its own sovereign finances and taking on debt to the absolute breaking point.
And speaking of breaking points, the data on page 12 pivots here to highlight hidden long-term threats.
As if the current economic and institutional situation wasn't tough enough.
Right. We have to look at the massive, unavoidable future costs looming on the horizon. The visual here is an area chart showing a steep, alarming upward climb.
It tracks the transport sector's CO2 emissions, which have climbed past 1.3 megatons of CO2 equivalent.
Off to the side, there is a KPI panel, a key performance indicator card, noting the alarmingly high percentage of the coastal population that is highly vulnerable to climate change.
This is where we transition from analyzing current crises to calculating future unfunded liabilities.
Outdated infrastructure like heavily polluting, highly inefficient transport networks isn't just an inconvenience that creates bad traffic jams.
No, it fundamentally restricts and chokes supply chains.
It makes moving raw materials from a factory to a deep water port incredibly expensive and slow, which further deters that precious FDI we just talked about.
And the climate change aspect is a massive future debt the country is racking up today, but with no plan to pay for it.
How does coastal vulnerability tie directly into the macroeconomic data we've been reviewing?
Well, if your coastal populations, your fisheries, and your agricultural sectors are highly vulnerable to extreme weather shifts, and you are not currently generating the surplus wealth needed to build massive seawalls, modernize irrigation systems, and physically reinforce your power grid.
The eventual cost of adaptation will completely bankrupt the system.
Exactly. You are essentially borrowing against a future you already cannot afford.
Which trickles down directly and painfully to the individual citizens. And that grim reality is captured on page 13 in the data on entrenched poverty and wealth distribution.
We've talked a lot about macro growth, FDI percentages, and demographic trends, but this waterfall chart, or funnel chart, shows the total failure of whatever macro growth does exist to actually reach the general population.
It tracks absolute poverty lines at $3 and $4.20 a day.
And the data shows a stubbornly huge portion of the population is trapped right there at the absolute bottom of the funnel.
The text annotation makes it undeniably clear. The wealth is failing to penetrate downward.
It's the definition of an economy of two extremes.
On one hand, you have a macroeconomic system floating on billions of dollars in overseas remittances, sustaining a baseline of imported consumer spending that makes the malls look busy.
On the other hand, because those remittances aren't creating productive formal jobs, millions of people remain entirely excluded from any meaningful, long-term economic advancement.
They are spectators to the economy, not participants.
Imagine trying to build a stable future, trying to gain a higher education, or trying to secure a commercial loan to start a small business when your entire daily existence is focused on surviving on $3 a day.
Meanwhile, the macro economy above you is awash in these billions of remittance dollars.
But you can't capture any of it because there are no formal mechanisms, no good jobs, no accessible credit to connect you to that capital flow.
That fundamental disconnect is the tragedy of the stalled engine. The labor force is willing, the demographic numbers are absolutely there.
But the transmission, the formal, legally protected productive job market, is entirely missing.
Which brings us to the climax of this entire presentation on page 14. The analysts use this section to tie this incredibly complex deep dive together into a single locked ecosystem.
The visual is a causal loop diagram.
It's essentially a map of a massive self-sustaining negative feedback loop. Let me walk you through how these nodes connect.
Go for it.
It starts with fragile institutions and security costs. That node points a direct arrow to low FDI and hollow industry.
Because there's no high-value industry, the next arrow points to scarce formal jobs.
Because formal jobs are scarce, the arrow points to youth in vulnerable jobs or relying on remittances.
And finally, that reliance and vulnerability leads to human capital loss, which circles right back around to weaken the institutions further.
And right in the dead center of this endless cycle is a large, heavy, gray padlock icon.
What's fascinating here is that the analysts are forcing us to step back and realize this isn't a simple checklist of isolated problems.
You can't just tell a policymaker, let's fix primary education today, and maybe we'll look at institutional corruption next year.
It is a completely self-reinforcing wheel. The gray padlock perfectly symbolizes that breaking this interconnected loop is the ultimate existential imperative.
If you don't break the loop simultaneously at multiple points, the demographic dividend just keeps cycling through the machinery until it is entirely ground down to dust.
So how do you pick that lock?
How do you break a cycle that is so deeply entrenched in the fabric of the economy? That is what the final blueprint on page 15 is all about, the strategic blueprint for resilience.
The stated goal is to violently grab the last remaining years of this demographic golden window before it closes forever.
The slide uses a very clean three-pillar infographic to lay out the survival strategy.
Let's break down those three pillars because they represent the only viable, mathematically sound path out of the loop.
Pillar 1 is human capital.
The specific target here isn't just a generic build more schools and hire more teachers. It is directly, aggressively targeting learning poverty.
It means totally reforming basic education so that time spent in a classroom yields actual, usable, globally competitive cognitive skills.
If that 65% of boys failing minimum reading standards doesn't drastically improve, no other sophisticated economic policy will matter.
You cannot build a skyscraper on quicksand.
Right.
You have to upgrade the fundamental human software. Then we move to Pillar 2, institutional credibility.
This is about building the ironclad rule of law to lower systemic risk.
The explicit, measurable goal here is to finally attract that missing 3% of foreign direct investment to build the factories and the tech hubs.
And that requires massive, unyielding political will. It means total transparency, aggressively fighting corruption at all levels, and creating a boring, stable regulatory environment.
An environment that foreign investors trust won't change on a whim after an election cycle. Capital needs to feel safe.
And finally, Pillar 3, industrial ecology. This one is genuinely fascinating because it requires a massive cultural shift.
The strategy is to shift the massive billions of dollars inflows of remittance money away from just buying imported consumer goods like flat-screen TVs and fast fashion and legally channel them into domestic business investments.
Finding a way to use the diaspora's massive wealth to fund high-value services and modern agriculture at home.
This is the economic concept of endogenous reform, fixing the system from the inside out using your own internal resources.
You cannot wait for a foreign savior or rely endlessly on external aid.
You have to take the capital that is already flowing into the country and build trustworthy financial instruments.
Like municipal bonds or domestic venture funds that allow citizens to invest their remittances into local startups, agricultural tech, and vital infrastructure.
That is how you finally build the transmission and reignite the engine. I have to marvel at the sheer, terrifying difficulty of doing all three of these things at once.
It is a monumental task.
You have to fundamentally fix the cognitive outputs of the schools, completely overhaul the legal and regulatory framework to eliminate deeply entrenched corruption, and culturally shift billions of dollars from immediate consumption to long-term investment.
All while the clock is loudly ticking on your aging population.
It is a generational task.
But it's the only mathematical way out. If you only fix education, but there are no formal jobs created by FDI, your highly educated youth will simply emigrate to countries that value their new skills.
If you fix the institutions to attract foreign factories, but the youth lack basic reading comprehension, the factories will leave.
It has to be a perfectly synchronized, multi-front effort.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to connect this incredibly dense, data-rich analysis back to you, the listener.
Why does a meticulous breakdown of El Salvador's economic paradox matter to someone listening right now, no matter where you live?
Because it is an absolute masterclass in the harsh realities of potential versus execution.
It proves beyond a shadow of doubt that raw potential, having a booming, young, vibrant, massive population guarantees absolutely nothing on its own.
Without the right institutional gears, the right educational framework, and the right economic ecosystem to capture and direct that energy, potential is just a theoretical concept.
It is a stark, sobering reminder that macroeconomics is not just about moving numbers around on a spreadsheet.
It is fundamentally about human systems, societal trust, and the unwavering rule of law.
And it leaves us with a genuinely chilling concept to ponder as we close.
We've talked entirely about the demographic dividend, the massive theoretical benefit of having a huge working-age population. But time only moves in one direction. People inevitably age.
So I want to leave you with this provocative thought.
What happens to a nation when the demographic dividend ages into a demographic burden before the country has ever actually gotten rich?
If the youth of today are trapped in vulnerable, informal, daily grind jobs with zero savings, no pensions, and no formal wealth accumulation, who exactly is going to pay for their retirement and complex health care tomorrow?
When that massive 67% of the population inevitably turns 70 years old and the economic engine is still disconnected, what happens then?
That is the silent, relentless ticking clock hiding behind every single chart we looked at today.
It really makes you look at that clean binary X-ray analogy differently, doesn't
The
it?
bones might not be visibly broken on the surface, but the body is aging rapidly.
And the clock is ticking louder every day. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you on the next one.